Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 121st episode of the Spiritual Brainstorm. In this episode, I'd like to talk about a sort of a non-dual interpretation of the current Russian and Ukrainian conflict. So again, because this is a very sensitive topic, if you feel strongly about it, I recommend that you do not watch this episode, because obviously I'm going to try to see beyond the good and evil kind of duality here. So just as a preamble, just to say that even I sort of got caught up with the whole emotional dimension of the conflict and posted on social media, outraged and disappointed and sad about what was happening. So this is by no means a way of saying I am beyond all of this. I am above all of this and none of this affects me. And of course not. I'm human. I have emotions. I have feelings. And therefore, I am invested in this reality in one way or another. The second thing I want to say is that regardless of all the things that I talk about in this video, it affects by no means the fact that, it has nothing to do with the fact that there's one truth that is beyond all of what I'm saying. It is that human beings are suffering and dying, and whether they are Russian soldiers or women and children or older people or even animals or whatever, the truth is that it's sad, and the whole point is that it would be nice if this could stop happening, if we could move beyond these kinds of tragedies. And so the whole point of this video is also to really ask the question of how to move beyond war and all these things. And obviously, my thesis is that it is certainly not via good versus evil, and this whole relying on other states to punish a belligerent state and choosing sides and demonizing an adversary, that is going to solve anything. It might make us move beyond this war, but not all wars. It is not a way to put an end to all wars. So here goes. So first, let's summarize basically the two positions that, of course, every party in this conflict is trying to paint themselves as being good and the other side as being evil. That is very typical. So, of course, for quote-unquote the Western states, their claim is very simple. Ukraine is a peaceful, democratic country and is being invaded by Russia, which is an evil dictatorship. Very simple. So you have some peaceful sort of neighbor and then an evil aggressor that comes. Now, from the point of the Russians, Putin and some Russians, Ukraine is a puppet democracy which only bears the name democracy because, in fact, the democratic institutions and rights are not really respected. And as a proof of that, in some of the regions, of Ukraine, including Donbass, where there are a lot of Russian minorities, which are actually majorities in many cases. That is, there are a lot of ethnic Russians in Ukraine. Their rights are being completely trampled by these so-called by the so-called democratic state of Ukraine. And because those minorities are, or majorities in some cases, are suffering at the hands of a state that doesn't respect their rights, then Russia has the right to intervene to protect the freedom of the Russian populations in those zones, and put an end to this kind of puppet show, basically. And of course, what Russia is saying is that the West is being totally hypocritical, because when it suits their political agenda, they will recognize independence claims from certain states and regions, like, for instance, in China, the Uyghurs, or the Chechens in Russia and whatnot. But when it doesn't suit their needs, then they're kind of ignoring the whole thing and trying to paint it in another light. Like, for instance, the Catalonian willingness for independence in Spain, which is being sort of brushed off in many cases. And the thing is, it's true that democratic states have a sort of an uneven, how should I say, an uneven record in terms of what they were doing in their own interventions. But this is just saying, since you're evil, then I can do the same. Why should you be able to invade territories in the name of freedom and I cannot? That's basically Putin's argument. And, both arguments are kind of valid, of course. I mean, but that's the whole thing. Like, if you get into this kind of duality, then you are stuck in a who is right, who is wrong. And all you're going to do is to collect pieces of evidence for each side, and then you're going to find somebody that represents one side that is opposed to you, and you're going to argue with them, and they're going to argue with you, and you're just going to create conflict. Now, part of the spiritual community is calling for going beyond this by just saying, let's focus on love. Let's focus on what brings us together. Let's not be sucked into this whole conflict, our whole attention and everything. And that is absolutely the right thing to do if by taking an interest or focusing your attention on the conflict, you are going to be sucked into one side or the other. Because if you do that, then you are feeding energy to duality. And the whole point, of course, is to go beyond duality. So, how do you do that? How do you put an end to all wars? Well, this is going to be a bit, I guess, long and difficult to explain, but there are certain problems that will only disappear when the underlying causes are dealt with. And here the root cause of many wars is the systems that we've put into place. And namely, nation states, for instance. When you have a configuration, when you have systems where basically you have a planet and you have various countries, and they represent a kind of a zone of cultural influence. And your aim is to expand your zone of cultural influence as much as you can, given the rules, the admitted kind of methods of your time, then that definitely leaves the door open to conflict, because when before, where you had kings, you just conquered the enemy, today you wage other types of wars, like economic wars and cultural wars, where you dump all of your products and cultural creations upon a country, so much so that they are starting to be more American, Chinese, or whatever, than whatever they were before. And all of their traditions, all of their linguistic, uniqueness and cultural uniqueness is harmonized under, Chinese food or McDonald's, basically, and Hollywood movies or other types of movies. So you see, this creates a sort of an ecosystem of culture, language, which is based on a kind of predator-prey relationship. And so today you see that the problem of nation states is that there is pressure from within to break down, and pressure from without in terms of their dissolution. So nation states are suffering from internal pressures. That is, if you look at Spain, you have regions that want to be autonomous. If you look at Italy, the north and the south are kind of at odds with each other. I mean, there's just so many states that are not even that are barely hanging together. Like, for instance, if you look at Belgium, it's also separated in two languages, and some Belgians know more about neighboring countries than they know about the other part of the country. So you have internal pressures and you have external pressures as well. That is, if you look at globalism, basically. But all of the multi or international institutions, like the European Union, and when you have that kind of configuration, so states are trying to still kind of survive in that environment, just like a human being. They're almost like a living entity which tries to survive. And Putin, our leaders, all of them are basically puppets at the service of these entities, which are, you can even say that they're egregores. Conscious thought forms, which take that consciousness from the sum of all consciousnesses, which feeds them, of course. So they gain a sort of a collective intelligence via all of the intelligences contained within them that feed them. So a country of 30 million people that are patriotic and believe in their nation state feeds energy to that living entity, and that living entity, that egregore, then in turn influences the people that are under its spell to do its bidding. That is, it wants to survive. It behaves like any biological creature. And in that type of configuration, therefore, you will always have conflicts, always have trying to conquer the cultural zone of influence, of expanding your zone of cultural influence. And what Putin did and what Russia did is just applying a methodology for expanding your cultural influence by using, how should I say this, by using means or strategies which are no longer publicly accepted. They're covertly accepted, and they're only accepted if you're doing it by using sort of a cloak of legitimacy to do so. Like, for instance, when the U.S. invades Iraq, it does so because it was a terrorist attacks, and then it had kind of this preemptive attack reasons, and came up with all kinds of bogus arguments to actually invade a country. So those are the basically like the three reasons, the three legitimate reasons for invading a country is preventing genocide. That's after World War II, basically, with what the Germany did to the Jews. Preemptive attack, that is, if you can prove that the other country is going to invade you. All of the signs are there, and they have all their troops at the border, and they're preparing to have things. You can strike them first. And the last one is, in case of an invasion, to roll back that invasion. So if, for instance, one country attacks another, like in the first Gulf War, Iraq invaded Kuwait, then the United States says, well, we have legitimacy to intervene because the sovereignty of a nation state was violated. But of course, you understand that many of these can be interpreted in many ways, and played with, and so Putin just uses this prevention of genocide kind of loosely, I guess, or even invasion, or the right to self-determination also. Right to self-determination as an excuse to use means that normally are forbidden, like violence and war and an army, to fulfill something that he believes is righteous, that is protecting the rights of the ethnic Russians that live in certain regions in Ukraine. But how do you get out of this system? Well, one way is simply to do away with nation states. Because right now the configuration of nation states is this egregore. All of these nation states are basically like daddies, big daddies. So the state is your father, so you have like big daddies, and then you have the children. That is the citizens, children. And the children basically follow what the daddy, the head of the family, decides. So just like in Romeo and Juliet, you have the the Capulets, and the, what is it, the other ones? Romulans? I don't know. Romulans, that's Star Trek. I can't remember. Montagues, that's it. The Montagues and the Capulets, two families warring against each other. And the heads of the families are the ones that sort of cement that kind of feud. And then the children, Romeo and Juliet, want to have peace. And the daddies don't want peace. And so today the children are basically, some of the citizens that just want peace. And the egregores, which manifest their will to sort of expand this kind of influence and their grudges and all that stuff, which manipulate our leaders that are just puppets in their hands, are playing the role of daddy, the head of the family that decides that we have to go to war with another family because daddy decided. Now, how do you extract yourself from the influence of daddy? Well, when you're a child, you simply grow old enough to be able to make your own choices and do not need your daddy or your father anymore. And so the idea is not to sort of go to war, to have a big rebellion and revolution against nation states where we overthrow governments and stuff. It is simply, as children, citizens, to show that we can self-organize in a coherent way where the state and nation states are no longer necessary. And you can see that with the emergence of so-called DAOs, or decentralized autonomous organizations, or also DHOs, that's for the seeds blockchain and community. I really encourage you to check them out, because I believe that these kinds of movements are a way for the future. Decentralized autonomous organizations rely on blockchain technology for a group of people, which can be 10, 100 million, to self-organize and make collective good decisions, have certain governance rules in a way which is not relying on a central authority or central figure to enforce them. It's enforced via this decentralized structure. And so that is a way of evolving out of nation states. And once you imagine if an entire country now functions with DAOs, more or less closely knit, along the lines of what political scientist Benjamin Barber is proposing, that is a world parliament of mayors, that is making cities the focus and not the states. That is already an advancement, because cities don't have that kind of way of thinking attached to them. Berlin doesn't, or Berlin or Brussels or Rome or Washington DC, they are not egregores that seek to, in the most part, to seek to expand their degree of their zone of cultural influence outside of their quote-unquote borders and swallow up other cities. Washington DC doesn't want to conquer Los Angeles and make the citizens think and talk the same quote-unquote language as Washington DC. I mean, it just doesn't make sense, you see. Now, this is just the first step, of course, because DAOs, or decentralized autonomous organizations, do not necessarily have to espouse a city. They can, but they don't have to. You can have multiple DAOs within a certain city. But that's the first step. So to show that you can self-organize without the need for daddy. And again, this is not to say that daddies are evil or that nation states are bad. This is just to say that this was an evolutionary step necessary for the growth of the collective, of the consciousness of humanity, and that we're growing out of the need for that kind of system and structure. Just like when you turn 18, 19, 20, and the older you get, the less normally you need daddy's kind of protection and oversight and all of his rules and limitations and all of the things that restrict you. But again, there are many ways to sort of take your independence from your parents. What you can do is run away at 16 and just sever completely the links with your family. And of course, if they're dysfunctional, you may not have a choice. But that is a very chaotic and abrupt way of doing it, and you're probably going to make a lot of mistakes in the process, and it's going to be very painful and hard. And so you do have certain people that are all for DAOs because they think that the state is evil and bad, and they're against nation states or states. And then their experience might actually be quite difficult, with a lot of conflicts within the community. Sometimes they might have to call the police because there are certain conflicts they can't solve themselves, and that creates a whole set of other problems. And simply because they might not have reached the required degree of maturity to be fully self-autonomous and self-sufficient and everything. But you can also do it very progressively. You can start living at stay at your parents' house for a while you are in your first year of studies and work to start making a living. Then when you have enough money, you can rent a small apartment and you ask your parents for help to furnish it and to fix certain things or check the plumbing and stuff because you don't have the expertise. And so the daddy is actually now helping you in gaining your autonomy, because normally when a parent is how should I say, when they're benevolent, their only wish is for creating, the happiness of a parent is when they see that their child they've raised them up to be autonomous and grow out of the need for their own parental supervision. And they're proud actually of their children. When you see it, like your kid goes out into the world and of course they can always call upon your help when they need it, when there's something unforeseen happens, and that's not a problem. But you see that they don't rely on you anymore and they can fend for themselves. That is a source of great pride and joy for parents. No sane parent, I would say, wants to keep their children under their full 100% control all the time and make sure that they stay dependent on your money, on your help, on everything. And the same can actually, I would like the same kind of process to happen in the future. That is, nation states actually encouraging governments, encouraging the setup of DAOs that makes their existing centralized structures no longer relevant, no longer necessary, as citizens grow out of the necessity for having governments to self-organize. That would be a beautiful transition. And once that happens, then these kinds of wars will no longer be possible. Because right now it's all about nation states going to war with one another. So when you dissolve nation states, the problem of war also disappears, and this kinds of competitions. Now there are many other things. And this one might come as a shock, but private property. Private property. Now you see, private property is also a way of conquest. Before, in order to expand your zone of influence, you just took a piece of land by force, and whichever authority or huge structure that you created, like in Thomas Hobbes' The Leviathan, the bigger the kind of monster that you created by assembling millions and millions of people together under the same kind of authority, the bigger your influence in capturing by force certain territories, and therefore expanding your zone of influence, of cultural influence. That is how empires were born. That is how kingdoms were formed, by the use of force, of actual physical force. Now, private property today is still conquest, but it's conquest by monetary force. That is just simply buy people out. And it is whoever has the biggest financial firepower that is able to expand their zone of influence. And of course, the way you get money, that can be then physical. But the link between the two is now a bit diluted and dissociated. Therefore, it appears as a less barbaric and violent system. But in essence, you would always have to check how people acquire their financial firepower to see if it's not just the same kind of system in disguise. When you see, for instance, like Chinese that are buying up huge swaths of land in Africa, is it any different than if they just came with their soldiers and took the land? I'm not really sure. I'm not really sure whether it is. It's just, I guess, a slightly more civilized way of playing this game of conquer and expanding your zone of influence. Now, in a few videos back, I was talking about this idea of collective stewardship, where pieces of land would no longer be able to be owned. They would be owned by a collective, but really by no one. When they're owned by everyone, they're owned by no one. And the collective would only have the usufruct, or the right to use a piece of land, and not to sell it. And in that kind of configuration, now there's no land that you can bicker over. It's just that imagine you have, okay, so how would this work? You have a city, houses, and imagine if the different pieces of land there are all owned by the community under this collective stewardship, and any human that joins that community and moves in automatically receives a little token or a little voting right to determine what to do and how to manage that collective piece of land. Whether they should build a permaculture farm or a children's playground, or leave it as a sort of a wild zone for children to play and discover and create and explore. And then whenever a person moves out, they lose that right. They no longer have that right. And so it's just that the lands that are in the vicinity or the proximity of where you live, you just have a right to determine to what use they should be affected. So what you should do with them. In that kind of configuration, and especially if these are also DAOs, that is, they're running on public blockchains which are unstoppable, uncensorable, and whatnot, then how do you conquer that? You can't really conquer that. You can't really take that by force. And if you're somebody at the other side of the world, you cannot own that token. You cannot affect those pieces of land. There's no property title to buy. And so what I'm saying is, anytime you create a centralized structure or power or system, they become a target for a game of power. If you create a democratic state, then the fact that it has rule of law and all of these powers, it creates an incentive for a lot of people to try and vie and compete for controlling and seizing that centralized system or entity, to gain power. And the same when you have this system of private property. The systems that we put in place are fundamentally at the root of why we have wars and conflicts. Because anytime you have a centralized system, or you have a pyramidal structure with somebody at the top, then it creates an incentive for people to try and fight for reaching to the top. If you create a structure which is network, arranged in the form of a network, where there is no central sort of authority that you can seize and now you have control over the whole network, then that removes a lot of the reasons for any conflict. I mean, there may still be local conflicts, but I don't see any global conflict out of this, because there's just nothing to gain. So, how would you invade a country where decentralized autonomous organizations are running everything. And the money system is not controlled by a central bank, for instance. That's also another thing, like the monetary system. And wealth. That's another system, the way that it works that incentivizes war. Because today, if you go into a country with your tanks and everything, you can seize the banks. You can seize the central bank. You can seize their gold, which is stashed in their vaults. You can do all that. And you can gain control of the whole payments infrastructure. But if all of the money is now running on public blockchains, then your only hope you will never be able, first of all, to seize anything, even if you invade with your little tanks and stuff. Even if you come with your tanks and you invade a zone which is run by DAOs, you'd have to cut off completely the internet. And that is very difficult because today you can create decentralized internets that run on, how do you call this again? Mesh networks. So it's networks where like each network is like a mobile phone that is connected via Bluetooth to every other mobile phone, which is like if you have a density of population where you have at least one person every 20 square meters or 100 square meters, then those phones then create a network of phones that are interconnected, and the messages can circulate. And you can very easily create a blockchain on top of that network. And so you would have to confiscate every single smartphone or device to be able to take down the network. Now the effort involved is huge, and the benefits are quite, I just don't see them. I just don't see, and you cannot steal the wealth, you cannot steal that money because it's encrypted, it's encoded behind keys, so you'd have to convince and threaten every single person to give away their keys. And even if they do, sometimes these currencies, they only have value in the eyes of the people and the communities that use them. So you seize that, but they may not have any value anymore to the eyes of other people. If you look at, for instance, what happens with hackers that take Bitcoin, for instance, those Bitcoins, because they can be traced, they're now blacklisted, and you can trace and track their every movement. So if a country invades, manages to confiscate all of the money that people have on their phones, on public blockchains, all of their Bitcoins or whatever, then and try to spend it into somewhere else in the economy, well, the unique signature of all those Bitcoins can be traced, and every time that rogue or bad state tries to spend that money, then people can refuse the transaction. Or that those transactions transacting with those Bitcoins could be forbidden. When today, if you take away somebody's gold, you just melt it and create other kinds of pieces of gold with it, and you can spend it. It's very hard to sort of to track and prevent this kind of laundering of gold, physical gold. But it's much more difficult to launder crypto assets. And so all that I'm saying is that we're moving from centralized systems and centralized structures, which always create an incentive for power and control and conflict, and then it's just pyramids against other pyramids. Like you have the Russian pyramid of power struggle and structure versus the United States and Europe pyramidal structure. And you can say that ours is more democratic and the other one is more like a fake sort of democracy, Russia. But a pyramid is a pyramid. Point. Regardless. Like a parent remains a parent. If you're living in your parents' house, whether your dad is an awful dictator or whether he's the nicest dad, you're still living in your parents' house and you're still depending on your daddy for everything. And so the citizens living under democratic rule or under Russian sort of dictatorship. Both of them depend on daddy, with two different daddies, two different philosophies, but they're still under daddy's rule. And the only way out of this, to stop these pyramids from fighting each other, to stop the families of Romeo and Juliet from fighting, is to create, to become autonomous, to sort of prove to daddy that you no longer need daddy. And of course you could do that in a very, how should I say, like radical way, where you have revolutions and stuff, which is not what I favor. Or you could do it via more progressive ways in cooperation with daddy, because normally the states should be delighted to see their citizens becoming mature enough to not need their antiquated centralized structures to function properly. So I hope this was kind of clear, and you see that this is not a good and evil kind of analysis. This is a how to make sure that we have no more of these wars, silly wars, in the future. And the solutions that I'm proposing is not something that is about judgment or about finding out who's right and wrong. It's about how can we mature enough as humans, as humanity, in our level of consciousness and the way that we organize, so that we no longer need the centralized structures and systems that are responsible for creating these power struggles that are internal and then that become external, inevitably. And even in structures like Europe, for instance, which you would say is a more successful way of combining different pyramids, one inside the other, with the European Union, you still have plenty of imbalances and rivalries between southern states and northern states, between the ones that are more indebted and less indebted, between the people that are more industrialized and less industrialized, and it's just on and on and on and on. And we spend a tremendous amount of money and time and energy just in keeping the peace because of the inherent incompatibility of pyramidal structures that just don't arrange well when you try to create a network out of them, because that network will invariably become another pyramid with something at the top, whether it's the European Central Bank, the European Council, the European Commission, or the European Parliament. And then the pyramids are engaged in power struggle with the top pyramid, and it's just a continuous struggle. And in my view, now the way that to build these networks is from the ground up. So you have a village that creates sort of a DAO and a network, and that DAO links up with another DAO based on shared and mutual concerns. So for instance, if those two cities have a shared river that flows through them, they're going to create natural links to manage that collective kind of asset or resource. And they will only form links on things that are of mutual importance. All the rest, whether this DAO chooses a certain model of education for their children versus another, is none of the other DAO's business or town's business. And people will be able to flow seamlessly, going from one DAO to the other. Joining and leaving networks will no longer be a problem. You won't be judged because you leave a certain city and go to another. You won't be seen as betraying your nation or whatever. And that in the future should happen as seamlessly as the way that your neurons rearrange their connections in your brain. As opposed to today, where you have this pyramidal structures which are extremely, they're stable because the triangle and the pyramid is extremely stable geometrical form, but it's also inflexible and resistant to change, and sometimes it'll snap and break. Whereas these kinds of networks, decentralized networks, are extremely adaptive, but you need to have humans inside of them that have grown enough in maturity and consciousness to be able to use them in a way that is not trying to recreate a pyramid inside the network. And that's very difficult still. And that's why also I prefer to do this as a step-by-step kind of thing, where we create DAOs that are under the patronage, under the supervision, under the help of nation states and centralized structures on things that are not vital for the community, so that people sort of get accustomed to how these DAOs work, you see, and learn how to use them, rather than creating these communities that want to achieve 100% full autonomy instantly with DAOs and try to manage everything through them and cut themselves from the state. It might work. I'm not saying it's not going to work, but it is adventurous, let's put it that way. Just like it is adventurous for an 18-year-old to just leave their parents' house and say, I'm cutting all my ties, I don't want to come back home, you can, I'm leaving my room, I'm taking everything, and that's it, that's the end, I don't want to hear from daddy anymore. For some it might be the right decision. I think that for most, though, it might be better to experiment with DAOs and these new ways of functioning progressively, and with decentralized structures that are, like I said, very stable and tried and true, as a backstop in case things go wrong. Like, for instance, you create these collective stewardships and you give people the right to vote, and they make a mess out of it for one reason or another. And so the state retakes all of these pieces of land and go back to under the control of the state. And some people view that as a tragedy. I see that as a learning process and a great thing to happen. I don't see all DAOs to be successful necessarily. In fact, they shouldn't, because sometimes it's better to leave your parents' house, live for a few months on your own, make plenty of mistakes with the landlord and everything, and then just go back like a dog with its tail between its legs back to your parents' house for a while. But at least you've learned something. At least you grew. At least you evolved. And there's no shame in failure and returning back for a while under a centralized kind of pyramidal, tried and true approach. And then try again, but with that extra maturity and that extra experience. And again, this is also a sort of a non-dual vision for this transition, because it's not rooted in better or worse or right and wrong, good versus evil. It's just a natural evolution and shift from pyramidal structures to network structures, and we see it already happening anyways with the emergence of crypto assets, blockchain, Bitcoin, all of that. So I hope you found this video interesting. Of course, it doesn't prevent anyone from being killed in the short term, so it doesn't really present any short-term kind of solution to these conflicts. If these conflicts really affect you, then the best thing you can do is, of course, finance, support organizations that are vying for peace and for healing the wounds of the wounded, like the Red Cross or any sort of humanitarian organizations. Certainly not funding organizations that are just pouring gas into the fire, like organizations that are trying to put more weapons in the hands of Ukrainians or whatever. But in the long term, if we want to make sure that this is the last war that we experience of that type, then the best thing you can do is to try to see how you can mature, gain enough maturity to be able to join these decentralized collectives and organizations be a part of that, and not relying on centralized pyramidal structures, or relying on them less and less. And by doing so, you simply remove, you just stop feeding them. You stop feeding them, and these egregores will naturally just, lose their power. And of course their ability to wage war. So if you have any comments, feel free to comment, and I'll talk to you in the next video.